This short lecture introduces the concept of social inequality, particularly as it applies to sex and sexuality. Social inequality is a concept that you've probably heard in Introduction to Sociology, and I hope in other sociology courses. I want to define it here again so that you have a little reminder, and then look at some examples of how it applies to sex. This is because for each of our modules, we're going to come back to the idea of social inequality and how it applies to the themes of that module. So listen to this now and visit again anytime that you need a reminder about this concept. Social inequality refers to the unequal treatment and outcomes for people based on different statuses in a society. These statuses could be gender, race, ethnicity, nation of origin, immigration status, religion, appearance, if someone's considered attractive or unattractive, region of the country, urbanicity, that is if they're from an urban or rural or suburban place, physical ability and disability, and of course sexuality, as well as lots of other ways that we distinguish between people. This unequal treatment results in unequal outcomes, could affect your opportunity and the results of those opportunities, the outcomes, including your SES, your social and economic status, your education, your health and longevity. Longevity is how long you live. Your access to political power, from basic things like, do you get a chance to vote? Or is your vote suppressed? Does your vote count or does it not count? To things like how much change can you make in your political world? And lots of other ways that our status and how we are perceived by others shapes our reality. In terms of sexuality, this works in two directions. First, how does your real or perceived sexuality, that is what people assume about your sexuality, whether it's accurate or not, how does that affect your opportunities and life outcomes? And then two, how does your status affect your sexual experiences? Could where you are in life actually affect your sexual opportunities, your sexual health? Sure. We can think about it this way. Think about this series of questions. Does it matter if you're gay or straight? In our world today, or in your specific world, would it matter if your sexuality was different? I've included a picture here of Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor from the film Giant. I think it's like 1955. He won an Academy Award, or was nominated for an Academy Award for this one. Rock Hudson was kind of a heartthrob of the mid-century, super handsome movie star, and passed away from what we now know are complications related to AIDS. And he was gay. But that could never come out in Hollywood. Because if you were gay in Hollywood in that time period, you'd definitely get blacklisted. It'd be hard. Obviously, they would have treated you like you could not be a romantic lead if you were a man. Or you couldn't be, if people thought you were gay, they wouldn't believe that you could play the role of a man who was heterosexual. Well, a Hollywood example is pretty far off. Most of us aren't going to work in Hollywood. But there are lots of other ways, other examples of ways that your sexuality could make you ineligible for certain kinds of jobs. For a long time, the official policy in all kinds of government jobs, if they required high security clearances, was that you couldn't be gay. Because if you were gay, the assumption was you had to be ashamed of it, and that you had secrets, and then if you had secrets you were ashamed of, then our foreign enemies could blackmail you, right? So if you were a spy and the Soviet Union found out you were gay, then they would blackmail you by saying they were going to tell your wife or going to expose you as gay publicly, and therefore you wouldn't be able to do your job well. And so certain positions of authority were not open to people who were gay. Certain jobs that required security clearances. lots of efforts were made, particularly in the 1970s and 80s and 1990s, to make it so that gay people couldn't be public school teachers, couldn't be Boy Scout leaders. And still today, gay people can be fired for being gay in private religious schools. So if you teach a Catholic high school, for example, and you come out as gay, that may be a fireable offense. In fact, it was only in January 2016 that Arkansas State University moved to include sexuality as a protected class in our equal opportunity hiring statement. That is, we made it explicitly clear that you could not be fired from Arkansas State University for being gay. And currently, there are major debates in Congress and efforts to put into law statements that say that people who, companies that do federal business, have a federal contract with the government, cannot be precluded from having federal contracts if they discriminate against people based on sexuality. So if I own a private company and part of my company says I can fire people, my company policy is I can fire people based on sexuality, there's been an effort to say that the federal government can't do business with a company that would fire people based on their sexuality. But there are efforts to make sure that the federal government, in fact, can do business with those people, and which means that the tax dollars that you as a taxpayer go to, that you as a taxpayer pay, can go to companies that choose to fire people based on their sexuality. So these are real life outcomes in terms of employment. And employment, just one domain where your sexuality might matter. Does it matter if you're perceived as gender conforming or gender non-conforming? Is following the rules, quote unquote rules, of what you are supposed to do as a man or as a woman, and those are the only two choices. Well, sure it matters. It matters in things like, what do people call you? In our language, we use ma'am or sir or Mr. or Miss or Mrs. And there's a push to include more language that recognizes that not everyone conforms to gender. So you may see MX period instead of Mr. or Ms. And that's a way of using a title that doesn't recognize someone's gender. But in some places, debates about gender conformity take the shape of fights over what bathroom you're allowed to use depending on what gender you look like. Does it matter if you're perceived as sexually experienced or sexually inexperienced? You might recognize these two pictures from the movie Grease. This is the hero, Sandy, who's kind of a goody two-shoes, sweet little foreign exchange cheerleader. And at the end of the movie, she becomes a naughty girl who's smoking a cigarette, dressed like a greaser. And this picture kind of illustrates what we call the Madonna and the whore complex. That women in particular, if they have sexual experiences, are considered deviant. We have all kinds of words to describe women who have sex and have too much sex. And of course, what is too much sex is also up for debate, but in some cases it's any sex. And then we have words to describe women who don't have sex. And either way, they're kind of trapped, right? They're either a Madonna, like not the Madonna the singer, but the idea of like the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary, who in Catholic theology remains a virgin for the rest of her life, and Protestant theology is at least a virgin until Jesus is born. And then she has a sexual relationship with Joseph, her husband, right? But anyway, the idea is someone who's sexually pure, we might call them frigid, a prude, a goody two-shoes. And then, of course, we have other derogatory terms for women who have sex. And does that matter in your experience? Yeah, sure. It matters particularly socially, how people will treat you. It might matter in your relationship, your sexual relationships. So I want you to think just briefly for a moment and jot down on a piece of paper who in your life would treat you differently if your sexual experiences were different, if your sexual identity was different, if your gender identity was different. And I'm not arguing that it's bad that someone would treat you differently. Yes, it's only bad if that difference was a bad difference. But think about all the people in your life, your peers and your classmates, your friends and your family, your neighbors, your coworkers, your employees, and even strangers who might, if they saw you differently, treat you differently. Or think about this question. How might your sexuality or your perceived sexuality, that is what people assume to be the case about you, whether it's true or not, how might that shape your life outcomes? How would your life be different? How would your education be different? What would going to school have been like as a kid if your sexuality or your gender identity or your sexual experiences were different? How would your experience in college be different? How would your health be different? How would your health care be different? Would doctors treat you differently? Would it be harder or easier to get health care? What would housing be like for you? Would you be able to rent the house you're in, or would you have enough money to live in the house you've bought? How would employment be different? Are there careers you couldn't consider? Are there jobs you wouldn't be able to get? Or maybe things would be easier. Again, everyone is going to have a different answer to this depending on what your sexuality is. But can you imagine if you were in a different space, if you occupied a different status, how would it be different? How might your socioeconomic status be different? Of course, this is also a reflection of your education and your employment level. What about your victimization? Victimization means what kinds of crimes or hurts or injuries might you suffer differently in a world where your sexuality or your perceived sexuality was different, or your gender identity or your sexual experiences. These are all ways that inequality arises from our sexuality, our gender identity, our sexual experiences. And so again, it goes two directions. Our sexuality can inform those outcomes, and those factors in our lives can also shape how we get to express our sexuality or what happens to us sexually. We'll keep those two directions in mind as you engage your reading this semester and your film viewing. Be asking yourself all the time, how does the person I'm reading about, how does their sexuality shape their life outcomes? And how did their life shape what sexual experiences they were allowed to have, or they did have, or they were forced to have in cases of sexual violence? Again, coming back always to those two directions. Feel free to come back to this short video as you need this semester. And if you need more examples or if you're confused about this concept, please let me know.